Hello beautiful people and welcome, to a video about pretty much everything there is to know about swap mechanics in Wuthering Waves. If you've watched any of the previous videos on this channel, or honestly, watched videos from other content creators, you've probably heard the phrase swap cancels before. So in this video we're going to be explaining what they are, but we're also going to be covering a lot of the swap mechanics that aren't related to just swap cancels that are very, very useful. First thing to understand is what a swap in this game does. So if you're coming from Genshin Impact, you probably have a preconceived idea of what a swap does, and the reality is that a swap doesn't do the same thing in this game as it does in Genshin. When you swap from one character to another, what you're telling the game isn't, okay, I am going to go from this on-fielder to this other on-fielder. What you're telling the game is, I want to start using this other character's abilities. And that doesn't sound like much of a different thing, but it very much can be, because you're not actually actively telling the game, okay, swap out of this character. Like, I don't want this character on the field anymore. What that means is that if your character is currently in the middle of an animation and you swap, they will stay on the field until that animation is over. But they do have to be in the middle of an animation for that to work. If you swap cancel before the animation starts, it's not going to do anything. Swap cancels can be very, very useful because there's a lot of abilities, like CC's Tap E, for example, where if you don't swap cancel it, it takes a while and you can be hit. And if you try to dash out of it to cancel it, you'll lose the damage. And so because of that, there's a lot of characters, especially characters that have longer animations, where doing a swap cancel isn't just like a potentially useful piece of tech, it's actually pretty much necessary for them to ever really feel good to play. A very good example of that is Kalcharo. Kalcharo gets most of his damage from his Resonance Liberation. A decent part of it being the Resonance Liberation damage itself through the initial hit and the Death Messengers, and a little bit from the basic attacks during the Resonance Liberation. The thing about that, though, is that every time he uses his Death Messengers, he becomes completely unable to input anything else, because if he does, he will lose the damage. Alright, the Death Messenger is this attack right here. And if I input something during the animation of it, the damage is just completely gone. Just like it was with CCF. And this is where swap cancels come in and become very, very important, because you can swap out if you have to. If you see an incoming attack, you can just swap out and dodge it that way without having to interrupt your Death Messenger. That's like the most basic thing there is to know about swap cancels. And as long as you know that, most things you should be able to do properly. But there's a few interactions with swap cancels that I do want to talk about, right? So first off, swap cancels do not work out of combat, right? If I get Cici on my team again and I do the exact same thing I was doing when I was in combat, she doesn't stay there and finish her animation. What that means is that you can't practice them out of combat. And the second thing is that there's a lot of abilities that only become swap cancelable after a certain point, or that aren't swap cancelable at all. A good example of that is Cicia's Hold E. Her Hold E that, fires off all of her bullets is not something that you can swap cancel. I'm not gonna get some bullets first. Alright, as soon as I swap out, it disappears. There's also certain abilities that only become swap cancelable after a little bit. Good example of that, for the Jian players out there, is the Phalian Baringal Echo. If you swap out of your character right as you hit the monkey, or as you hit with your monkey, the first hit will go through, but the second hit won't. If I use it and then immediately swap out, I do get the first hit, we saw the damage number, but it didn't do the second one. However, if I make sure that the first hit connects before I swap out, I do still get the second hit. Pretty much every ability in this game falls into either the swap cancelable on frame 1, swap cancelable after a certain condition is met, or not swap cancelable at all. I'm not gonna give you a complete list of everyone, but as a general rule, most abilities that don't need you to like keep inputting stuff are swap cancelable frame 1, or at the very least very early. Alright, so most abilities, you just press them and then you can immediately swap out. So the biggest examples of abilities that like need to meet a certain threshold to be swap cancelable are a lot of the active echoes that are multi-hit. So if you're looking at the arrow, the monkey echo, you need to get the first hit to swap cancel it. If you're looking at Tempest Mephis, if you swap cancel it, you won't get the second hit. You need to actually input the second hit to get it. Thundering Mephis, if you swap cancel it, you're not going to get any of the hits past the one you were currently doing. Crownless, same thing. Infernal Rider, same thing. You want to make sure that you swap cancel it after you've input the third hit, because that's pretty important. Something that I think a lot of people are also not aware of when it comes to these echoes is that even if you do swap cancel them, you still get the buffs. Right? If I swap out after this like that, right? I was all field when the hit happened, but you still get the 12% arrow damage, heavy attack damage from the echo hit. So as long as you're meeting your condition, even if you're meeting it while it's not your active character, you'll still get the buff. This is especially relevant for the Impermanence Heron. A lot of people in my last video's comments were confused about the wording on this. This says, once the initial attack lands on any enemy, the current resonator regains 10 resonance energy. So the current resonator is not the one you're currently controlling, it's the one who has transformed into Impermanence Heron. So that's number 1. And 2, there's a period here. And then the next sentence is unrelated. If the current character uses their echo skill within the next 15 seconds, the next character's damage dealt will be boosted by 12%. So. I get my outro, and then I swap into my Havoc Rover and then use their skill. 2481. I do the exact same thing, but this time I swap cancel my Heron before it does its first hit. Alright, so if I do the same thing with the Heron, I use my E. 2622. We are benefiting from that 12% damage bonus. In any case, that's the main thing when it comes to swap cancels. And then when you're putting your swap cancels in practice, it's generally just mainly going to be because you want to be generating more energy and doing more damage. If I use my E on my Havoc Rover and that's it, and then I keep hitting, I get this amount of damage, I generate the amount of energy I get from one E, and that's it. But if I use my E, I swap while during that and then I come back, I just get additional free damage. Now you might be thinking, Havoc Rover E? That's not a long animation, I don't need to swap cancel that. And that's true, but one thing I want you to keep in mind is, while there is a cooldown on swap, and it's not a global cooldown, it's per character, right? So if I swap to one character, I can immediately swap back to the first one, but I can immediately swap through 2 characters. Almost immediately. It's very quick. If you have a short animation that is an animation that, is swap cancelable, you can still use it to swap to another character if that swap to another character pauses time. And what do I mean by pauses time? Well, as it turns out, most ult animations in this game pause time, and as you can see, by the time my ult animation was over, my Havoc Rover was still in their E animation. On top of that, while they do pause time overall, they don't actually pause your swap timer. Stay behind. Shackles be gone. And you can, just like that, I swapped back into my Havoc Rover before the animation was even over, and I had time to use my Sunhawk intro and ult, because both her intro and her ult pause the timer. And so when you're doing a clear, keep that in mind. If you have an ult that you see is available, which you can see, right, they will be on the screen if their ult is available, right above their concerto. If it's not an ultimate that you need to use at a specific time, then that's a swap cancel that is effectively free. But then another way that you can use swaps and swap cancels in general is through the use of other swap mechanics. If I'm on Sanhoi and I start attacking, I have a 5-hit combo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. we'll be using her third hit as our benchmark, right? The spinny hit is the third hit. But if I'm into her and if I swap into her while I'm in combat, she automatically does an attack. And that attack that she does isn't something that is separate from anything else, right? There is no swap in attack damage anywhere in here. It's not included in the intro skill. It's not anywhere. So what is that? Well, that's different for every character. In Sunho's case, as you can see, if I do a normal attack right after that hit, it's the spinny thing, which means that her swap in attack is her second normal attack. What that means is that you can use swaps as a way to accelerate your normal attack string. Sanhua specifically cares about this a lot because she gets increased forte damage after her basic attack 5, and if you have her constellation or whatever it's called 1, she also gets 15% crit rate out of it. If you're swapping into her without an intro, or without her intro, right, without getting an outro on another character, instead of 5 attacks, you only need to do 4. And this is a mechanic that doesn't just affect swaps, it also affects perfect dodges, right? So if I perfect dodge, as you can see, the attack I do is the N3, not even the N2, so I get accelerated by 1 more. So after a counter, you only need 3 attacks to get your N5. But then on top of that, for some characters, that's also going to be different when they trigger their intro.
Stay behind me.
The first hit after my intro is the N3, which means I only have to do 3 attacks after the intro to get that N5. Now that's a mechanic that's useful not just for Sanhua, but honestly for pretty much every team and every character, because the attack that you're doing when you swap in, it happens automatically. You don't even have to input anything. And so what that means is if you swap into a character and then into another character, you get that attack for free, basically, without really it requiring any additional time. That attack will generate the same amount of concerto and resonance energy that it usually does. And if your character has any specific interactions in their kit, any specific upsides from using that attack, they will get it as well. This swap-in attack is going to be different for each character. But on the GM team, it actually matters a lot both on Mortify and on Verena. Because your initial first rotation is always started in tower with no concerto whatsoever, which means you don't get to trigger your intros. Now, because the intro is one of the ways you generate concerto energy, it means your first rotation and your follow-up rotations will not necessarily be the same, because your first rotation needs to generate more concerto, because it doesn't have those intros. At least it doesn't have that first one. What that means is that for a character like Verena, baseline, right? If you use her ult, you use her E. I'm just gonna get hit because I don't want to generate concerto from the dodge. And then you do 1, 2, 3, 4. If you don't get the 5th hit here, even if you jump and do your thing, you don't get enough concerto to fully proc it, fully proc your outro. Which means you're effectively guaranteed to need to make it all the way to your N5, which is the one that gives you a stack of her forte that you can use to generate more concerto with her mid-air attack. However, getting all the way to N5 takes a while. So you can use this normal attack acceleration tech to swap into her while you're in combat, swap into her, and you do 2 more attacks and you get your stack, right? Her swap in attack is her N3, which gets her really far on her attack string, and because she needs to get to N5, that's a pretty big deal. It speeds things up a lot. And also keep in mind, if you have to dodge because of an incoming attack, that also cancels your attack string. Now, that being said, her follow-up attack to a dodge is an N4, which means that if you do have to dodge on her, that's actually not bad. It's the counter, and then you do N4 and then N5. Which means, if we're starting with literally 0 concerto, with a refinement 1 variation, swap into her, N4, N5, E, jump, auto, ult, and that's enough concerto to trigger her outro. Let's get our ultimate back. Obviously, you'd want to use the ult before you jump, because that way you can swap out while you're midair, but I didn't have it because I don't have enough ER on my Verena. Yeah, if you're looking at the no variation rotation, if you didn't unfortunately get lucky enough to get it, because I don't think there's a 3-star that gives Concerto energy.
Ready for battle.
Right, if you're doing the same thing, again, I don't want to dodge because I don't want to get the Concerto from a perfect dodge. Oh. You just have to add one auto and you're gonna be good. Thing is, that's not just helpful for Verena in this team, because as it turns out, Mortify's swap in attack is an N4. Alright, it's the last attack in his string. And as it turns out, his N4 is the one that generates the most Forte and the most Concerto out of his attacks. Outside of his skills, obviously. But more Forte means more skills, which also means more Concerto. What that means is you can do something like this. Just from that swap in, I got a pretty good amount of Concerto energy, pretty much for free. Now that's not always useful. There's a bunch of rotations that I think don't care that much about it. But even in those rotations that don't care that much about it, the fact that he starts at N4 still matters a lot. Because it means that while you're building his Concerto, I swap into him, trigger his intro, use his E, and that generates enough Forte from 0 to use the second E from the Enhanced Forte skill. And that second E has a medium-ish length animation that is swap cancelable. And it's something I've slightly covered in the previous video, but here we will explain why it's so useful. You trigger your intro, use your E, E, swap out, and then swap back into him and you get your N4 for free, which makes generating Forte for another Forte skill very easy, and that plus either some dodges or just casting the ultimate gets you enough Concerto for your outro. And then you do the same thing we were talking about earlier, which is use your Heron and then immediately swap out.
Let's do this another way.
I did not hold it because I'm an idiot, but it's okay. Yeah, use your Heron and then immediately swap out, and you end up with a very, very short Concerto generation window. Yeah, so what you end up with is a very fast Concerto generation, even without a Concerto weapon, right? Again, like, he is not using a weapon that gives him any Concerto. And he can have slightly faster rotations with the, I think, Cadenza, the Concerto generation weapon, but it's actually not that much faster, and he loses a lot of damage because he doesn't actually need the ER from the main stat. But you can still use a double swap into him and then immediately swap out at the start of your rotation and then back to him after your Gian Echo. And with, I think, R2 plus Cadenza, it's just enough Concerto without needing a second Forte skill. Anyways, if we do the rotation from the start,
Fury boils, burn to ashes. As you wish, till truth with the sun. Burn. You're wide open.
but as you can see, right, we get very fast Concerto generation, and obviously Mortify's ult is deciding to be bugged today, so it is what it is. We're not getting any damage from him, but that's okay, it happens. And then on the second rotation, very similar thing. Here, obviously, I don't have enough energy to use my old arrow rotation on Verena, but it is what it is. One thing I want you guys to be careful of, though, is it is actually important that you don't swap back into Mortify too early. Because we are relying on the fact that his swap in attack accelerates his attack string to basic 4. Without doing that, you don't get your basic 4 very early, and because the basic 4 is the one that generates the most Forte, if you then have to dodge an incoming attack, you're not going to make it to your N4 during the enhanced Forte generation from your normal skill, and then it's going to take you 2 or 3 more seconds to actually get your Concerto. Which is easiest to see when you proc an outro, because it pauses the timer, obviously. But if I proc my outro during my E animation, and then I immediately swap back to him, as you can see, I don't get my N4 when I swap in, And it is going to take longer to get that Forte generation, and that Controller generation, and that Liberation Energy generation. All of this to say, making use of your acceleration is important, and this is one of the teams where that can impact things a lot. Obviously, because often enemies interact with you a lot, you can't necessarily be doing perfect rotations, so knowing that if you swap back to him like this while his animation is still going prevents you from getting that acceleration is pretty useful. Anyways, next swap mechanic I want to talk about is how swaps interact with buffs. So I've already talked about how most of the, or pretty much all of the echoes that give buffs will still give the buff if it hits while your character is off field. But what about buffs that only apply to characters while they're on field? One of the most infamous changes from CBT2 to the live version is that outro buffs don't carry over through swap cancels anymore. Back in CBT2, from what I've understood, if your character model was still on screen when you swapped back into them, you wouldn't lose any buffs that are supposed to be lost when you swap out of a character. They have changed this, and now unfortunately, your buffs are lost as soon as you swap out. We take a look at the damage I get with a Sanhua buff on my Cixia, on the N3 because it's one that you can swap cancel. Alright, 1, 2, alright, I get 331 on the hit. However, if I swap cancel it, 240. Let me try to swap cancel it in the middle of it. I don't know if editors can zoom in on that, but you can see that the first hits do that enhanced damage, but as soon as my swap out is registered, the buffs expire. That is unfortunately a pretty big deal for characters like Galcharo that have very long animations that you want to cancel. Obviously, it's hard for me to show because I don't have Jensen or Ian Lin, but it does mean that if you use his ult and then start your Death Messenger and then swap out during that Death Messenger animation, your Death Messenger will not benefit from the Liberation damage from Jensen or from the Electro and Liberation damage from Ian Lin. The unfortunate reality is that you kind of still have to cancel them in a lot of situations because obviously you get locked into a very long animation. It's hard to avoid incoming damage during that, and if you have useful things to do on your other characters during that animation, then obviously you want to do those things. Does that mean that every buff that says that it disappears when you swap works like this? Well, no. The attack set, which says, while on field, attack increased by 5% every 1.5 seconds. This affects stacks up to 4 stacks, right? If I'm on field, you can see my attack goes up to 1928, but as soon as I swap out, down to 1811. If you swap out in the middle of an attack, and then swap back in while your character is still on field, right? Let's start at 1928. Well, swap out during the animation and swap back in before the animation is over, I'm still at 1928. Which means that there are things in this game that trigger once your character actually completely disappears, and there are also things that trigger when you press the swap. That's very relevant for future characters because any sort of buffs, they could decide to make it work either way. In any case, when it comes to swap interactions, how early you can swap on a character, how long their animations are, and what happens when you swap back into them are 3 elements that matter a lot when it comes to characters. It's going to matter a lot in a way that is going to be hard to see just from reading their kit and looking at their numbers. And even from doing their character trial, because in the character trial, you only have 1 character, so you can't see you can't check what's swap cancelable and what's not. And so, what I want you to learn from this video is, 1, if there's a specific character you really like playing, you enjoy them, whatever, and it's one I haven't talked about today, you should find out which part of your basic attack string you get to when you swap in and when you do a dodge counter. Because for a lot of characters, the fact that it gets accelerated means a lot. It makes it so that you can get to later parts of your string that wouldn't really be worth getting to otherwise. Doing all the way from N5, from N1 to N5 on Sanhua increases her rotation length in a way that's honestly too much to really be worth it. But if you don't have President's Chain 5 or C5, whatever, which is bugged and actually does something that doesn't say it does, which is it increases your Forte generation and your damage, in a way that it doesn't say it does. But yeah, if you're just triggering Sanhwa's intro, using her ult, using her skill, and then using a Forte charge attack, use your ult,
Shackles be gone.
use your skill, and do your Forte charge attack, you don't actually get all the way to your concerto. I don't want to dodge because I don't want to... You're going to have to do at least... Again, I don't want to dodge because I don't want to get concerto out of that. At least 3 autos anyways. But if you're going to have to do 3 autos anyways, well, since you're getting accelerated to your N3 already on your swap in, then why not, instead of doing N1, N2, N3 at the end, do N3, N4, N5 at the beginning? It's going to make it so that you get this buff, and if you have her constellation, this buff as well. Now, once you get her C5, again, it doesn't do what it says it does. It makes your Glacier detonate twice, which also makes it generate Concerto energy twice, which increases your Concerto energy generation. And so if you have that, you don't necessarily need to do the attacks, and so it may not be worth it because it extends her field time. But if you don't have it, then her optimal Concerto generation, or her optimal Concerto rotation is going to be swap in, do 3 autos. Of course, my third auto missed, because it decided to fly away.
A change of perception.
And then do your old skill Forte and then swap out. So, while swap cancels are very important, there are other types of cancels that can be useful. Mainly, a lot of abilities will register their stuff, the stuff that they do, before they actually finish their animation. Usually that's referred to as the end lag of an attack, is like the animation time during which you're stuck still doing the attack, but after which anything that the attack actually does has been registered. And Sanhwa is actually another character where that matters a lot. So if I look at Sanhwa, and I use my E, and then do my Enhanced Forte, and then immediately dash out, it's not gonna make my thing explode. However, if I use my E, wait for the first hit, and then dash out, it is going to explode. What that means is that you don't necessarily have to wait until the second hit before you do something else. Now, one of the situations where that matters the most is when you already have a lot of Concerto, because you had to adapt your rotation for some reason, and you generated Concerto energy on Sanhwa before swapping into her. What you can do is you can use your Echo to cancel the end lag of your Forte charge attack, and then swap out before the explosion happens, which is going to make it so that you get your outro on her. And then after proccing the outro, you'll generate additional Concerto energy from the explosions. If I do this,
Shackles be gone. A change of perception.
I still got my explosion, but as you can see, I generated like a little bit over a quarter of her Concerto after I swapped. So that's another way that you can use those cancels and those swap interactions to get more value out of your characters. Now, obviously, a lot of these mechanics are going to apply to a lot of different characters in a bunch of different ways, and I can't really go through every single one in one video, especially because there's a bunch of characters I don't have, so it's going to be a lot harder for me to, actually test what sort of cancels are possible for them. But if you have some interesting cancels that you are aware of, that you don't see other people talking about, let me know in the comments. Obviously, I haven't covered every single type of cancel. There's also going to be some character-specific bad attack strings that you want to avoid, so you want to cancel out of it earlier. And but that's not really what this video is for. It's more so about the sort of cancels that are only possible in Wuthering Waves because of the way that its system works. And yeah, as usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.